If the idea that the air above your city right now might be carrying both record breaking moisture and organisms that have survived a 5,000-mile journey across the Atlantic has you as unsettled as it has me, make sure you hit like and subscribe to Signal Watch so you don't miss a single update as this story continues to develop. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, what time it is there, and tell me this. Has your region experienced flooding or unusual air quality events in the last 2 years that seemed completely out of character for where you live? Because that pattern, that sense that the weather is doing something it has never done before in your particular corner of the world, is exactly what the data predicts. If you want to help this community keep growing, share this video on X, Facebook, Reddit, or even just in your group chats. You are the reason we can keep chasing stories like this. So thank you for having our back. A moisture record broken in 2024, and then broken again in 2025, with the first 8 months of this year recording the highest atmospheric water vapor transport since observations began. Exceptional atmospheric rivers, the Category 5 events that cause hundreds of millions of dollars in damage, projected to go from once per decade to twice per 3 years. A wall of Saharan dust crossing 8,000 kilometers of open ocean, carrying the DNA of organisms on the World Health Organization's list of global priority pathogens, and a Texas A&M laboratory finding over 2,000 organic chemical groups inside a single dust event that arrived in Houston. And the compound connection that nobody has fully mapped yet. What happens when an intensifying atmospheric river and an active biological dust plume interact over the same coastline? And why the answer to that question is not what anyone assumed.
Now settle in and let's get into it. There's a river above you right now. Not a metaphor. Not a loose approximation of something vaguely moisture related. A real, physical, measurable structure. A corridor of concentrated water vapor hundreds of miles wide, thousands of miles long, moving through the atmosphere at speeds that would qualify as a sustained gale if they occurred at the surface. On any given day, these structures carry over 90% of the global north-south water vapor transport across the mid-latitudes, and they occupy, on average, less than 10% of the sky doing it. You cannot see them without satellite imagery. You cannot feel them until they arrive. But they are up there, right now, in both hemispheres, moving moisture from the tropics toward the poles, threading through the jet stream, bending with it, stalling against coastlines, releasing their cargo in days when weeks' worth of rainfall is the result. They are called atmospheric rivers. And the story of what is happening to them, what they are becoming, where they are going, and what they are carrying is the story this investigation is built around. Start with the scale, because without scale, nothing that follows lands properly. F. Martin Ralph is the director of the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego. He has been studying atmospheric rivers for most of his professional career. He is, by most measures, the world's leading authority on the phenomenon. Here is how his team measures them. Integrated Vapor Transport, or AVT, a metric that captures not just how much water vapor exists in a column of air, but how fast that column is moving and in what direction. Kilograms of water vapor, transported per meter of atmospheric river width, per second. It sounds abstract. The numbers make it concrete. A single atmospheric river spanning 800 kilometers, which is a typical width for the systems that strike the Pacific Northwest, carries roughly 400 million kilograms of water vapor every second. That is approximately 19 times the average flow of the Mississippi River at its mouth. 19 times, not 19% more. 19 times the volume of one of the largest rivers on the planet, moving through the sky, invisible, above the clouds. And IVT, values above 250 kilograms per meter per second, are what researchers use to define the lower boundary of AR conditions. 250. The events that have been causing the flooding you have seen on your news feed recently, the Pacific Northwest events, the California events, the European events, have been recording IVT values of 750 kilograms per meter per second and higher at landfall. The November 2025 California system peaked at ensemble guidance suggesting potential values above 850 kilograms per meter per second. The December 2025 Washington State system was tracked as a Category 4 on the Ralph scale, with peak IVT exceeding 750 and duration of approximately 96 hours at some locations along the coast. That duration matters more than most people realize, and we will come back to why. But first, the record. In November 2025, the Washington Post published an investigation drawing on the ECMWF-ERA 5 atmospheric reanalysis, the state-of-the-art monitoring tool that combines satellite observations, weather balloons, aircraft measurements, and surface stations to reconstruct global atmospheric conditions back to 1940. Their finding was this: the movement of atmospheric moisture during the first 8 months of 2025 was higher than any other year since observations began. Not comparable to the record, not approaching the record. Higher. An all-time record for the era of satellite-era measurement. The record it broke was set in 2024, 2 consecutive years, back to back. The highest, and then the next highest, atmospheric moisture transport in the history of the observational record. Over the full period since the 1940s, the post-analysis found that the total amount of water vapor moving through Earth's atmosphere has increased 12%. 12% does not sound like a large number. Here is what it translates to: an additional 35 Mississippi rivers worth of moisture flowing through the air above us every second, compared to the atmosphere of 80 years ago. 35 Mississippi rivers, not added to the oceans, not stored in soil, moving. Airborne, concentrated in the narrow filaments that deliver it to coastlines, in events that are being described as once in a generation with increasing frequency. That 12% is not evenly distributed. Christine Shields is a scientist at the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, and she was among the experts consulted for the post-analysis. The moisture increase is concentrated in zones of peak vapor transport. The strongest bursts of moisture that travel through the air in any given year are where the signal is loudest. In Valencia, Spain, peak integrated vapor transport surged 11.3% in just 3 decades, more than 3 times the global average rate of increase. Valencia was the site of catastrophic flooding in late October 2024 that killed over 200 people. The moisture available to fuel that event had been building for decades in ways the regional infrastructure was not designed for. It's just the extreme versions that cause the most harm, Shields said, and we know we will see more of these extremes with climate change. That is the opening frame of this investigation. Not a projection, not a model output, a measurement. The atmosphere above us is carrying more water than it has in the modern observational record. The records are being broken in consecutive years, and the systems that concentrate that moisture and deliver it, the atmospheric rivers, are not behaving the way the models predicted. They are behaving worse, but the numbers from the moisture record are only the beginning of what the data shows. Because what Ralph's team and researchers across the atmospheric science community have documented over the past several years is not just that atmospheric rivers are getting wetter, it is that they are getting stronger, they are lasting longer, they are arriving in sequences, and they are moving, drifting poleward, targeting coastlines and regions that have never had to build levees, never had to manage reservoir releases, never had to evacuate communities because the river in the sky decided to park itself overhead for 4 days. The invisible river is changing course, and the communities in the new territory it is heading toward have no idea it is coming. In February 2019, F. Martin Ralph and Jonathan Rutz of the National Weather Service published a paper in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society that did for atmospheric rivers what the Saffir-Simpson scale did for hurricanes. They gave them a number, a category, a way to communicate to water managers, emergency officials, and the public what was actually on its way. The Ralph Rutz scale runs from 1 to 5. Category 1, weak, primarily beneficial. Category 2, moderate, mostly beneficial, somewhat hazardous. Category 3, a balance of beneficial and hazardous, helps fill reservoirs, but can push rivers near flood stage. Category 4, Extreme, mostly hazardous, but still beneficial if the region is in drought. Category 5, exceptional, primarily hazardous. The system description is direct. These storms cause damage, full stop. The scale is not based on wind speed, the way a hurricane scale is. It is based on two variables: the peak IVT value inside the system and the duration that the system spends over a given location. Duration matters because the soil underneath can only absorb so much water so fast. An atmospheric river that arrives, dumps a large quantity of moisture, and moves on quickly may produce flooding but allows runoff to begin. An atmospheric river that stalls, that parks itself against a mountain range or coastal topographic feature and cycles moisture into the same watershed for 30, 40, 60, 96 hours, saturates the soil completely, fills every reservoir to capacity, and converts every subsequent hour of rainfall into direct runoff, into streams and rivers that are already at or above flood stage. The benchmark Category 5 event, in terms of the historical record, was the atmospheric river that struck the California Central Coast beginning December 29, 1996. It lasted over 100 hours. The associated precipitation and runoff caused more than $1 billion in damage, the largest flood event in California since 1950. One storm, 100 hours, $1 billion. That was, at the time, considered exceptional by definition. Now look at what December of 2025 produced in Washington State. The Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes published its event summary on December 23, 2025. A strong atmospheric river transporting very moist air from the subtropical western and central North Pacific made landfall over Washington and Oregon early on December 8th. What followed was not a single event, but a compound one. A second pulse of moisture transport moved onshore late on December 9th, and AR conditions over Washington persisted through December 11th. Total duration at some coastal locations, approximately 96 hours. A R Category 4 at the coast. A R Category 3 over the western, Cascade foothills, and central Washington and Oregon. This AR produced more than 10 inches of precipitation over the Olympic Mountains, the Washington Cascades, and the Cascade foothills. The combination of saturated soils, heavy rainfall, and high snow levels resulted in widespread significant riverine flooding across Washington state. 5 stream gauges experienced record flooding. 16 others exceeded major flood stage. The National Weather Service received numerous reports of flooding and landslides in Washington and northwestern Oregon. A 49-mile stretch of U.S. Highway 2 was closed and not expected to fully reopen for months. NASA's visualization of the event, published in January 2026, calculated that this single atmospheric river system delivered an estimated 5 trillion gallons of water to the Pacific Northwest over 1 week. 5 trillion gallons. And here's the detail that the headline numbers obscure. That moisture, that 5 trillion gallons, did not originate off the coast of Washington or Oregon. NASA's Earth Observatory tracked the moisture corridor back to its source. It had traveled approximately 7,000 miles, from near the Philippines, across the entire breadth of the Pacific Ocean. A transcontinental moisture pipeline, 11,000 kilometers long, connecting subtropical Asia to the Pacific Northwest of the United States, delivering the equivalent of 19 Mississippi rivers per second for 4 days. The December 2025 California system, building the week after, carried IVT values forecast above 750 kilograms per meter per second along the central and southern California coast, with ensemble guidance indicating potential for above 850 at peak intensity. 3 successive atmospheric rivers were forecast to impact California between December the 20th and 25th. 7-day rainfall totals of 250 to 510 millimeters, 10 to 20 inches over the Sierra Nevada. Each increase in AR category corresponds to roughly a 10-fold increase in median flood damages. Category 1 events. Median damages under $100,000. Category 5 events. Median damages over $250 million. That is not a linear scale. It is an exponential one, And the most dangerous thing about it is what happens when the exponential events cluster. Because the data from the past 4 decades has revealed something that the insurance models, the emergency management frameworks, and the water management systems were not built to handle. The worst atmospheric rivers do not arrive alone. Between December 26, 2022 and January 17, 2023, 9 atmospheric rivers hit California. Not 9 over the winter, 9 in 22 days. By the time the last one made landfall, the soil across much of the state was saturated. The reservoirs were managing releases to prevent dam failures. The rivers were at or near flood stage before each new system arrived. 21 people died. The losses, from flood insurance claims, from emergency response costs, from infrastructure damage across the state, exceeded $3 billion. That winter became the case study for a research effort led by Corinne Bowers, then a doctoral student at Stanford, working in the laboratory of Professor Jack Baker, a civil and environmental engineer at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Bowers analyzed 30 years of flood insurance data and county-level economic loss estimates from the National Centers for Environmental Information, and she asked a question that seems obvious in retrospect, but had not been systematically quantified. When atmospheric rivers arrive in rapid succession, within 5 days of each other, what does that do to the damage calculation? Her results, published January 19, 2024, in the journal Science Advances, were more severe than she expected. When I started this work, I was expecting the losses to be 10 or 20% higher for atmospheric rivers occurring in a sequence, Bowers said, but the losses are tripled or quadrupled. Not 10 or 20%, 3 to 4 times. The mechanism is straightforward but underappreciated in the public narrative around individual storm events. When the soil is already saturated from the first event, the second event has nowhere to put its water except directly into runoff. When reservoirs are already near capacity after the first storm, water managers must release water continuously during the second storm, releasing water downstream into communities that are simultaneously trying to manage their own flooding. The buffering capacity of the hydrological system, the soil's absorption, the reservoir storage, the river's ability to carry elevated flows below flood stage, that buffering capacity does not recover in 5 days. It barely recovers in 2 weeks. But it is not just the damage multiplication that Stanford found. It is who arrives in sequences. From 1981 to 2021, 40 years of data, Category 4 and Category 5 atmospheric rivers that caused flood damage were almost always part of a sequence, not standalone events, part of a series. Moreover, Category 5 events are more than twice as likely to be preceded by another Category 5 event than a purely random distribution would predict. The strongest systems cluster. The most dangerous events travel in packs. Bowers and her team quantified the loss multiplier with precision that is difficult to fully absorb. Losses from Category 5 events are approximately 1,600 times larger than those from Category 1 events. 1,600 times. Not 1,600% more. 1,600 times the absolute number. The confidence interval is wide, 350 to 7,100, but even the lower bound represents a damage ratio that no residential insurance model was calibrated to anticipate. Now take the projection. Research published in Scientific Reports in August 2022 used 14 global climate models from the CMIP5 ensemble to project how atmospheric river frequency by category will change across the 21st century. The findings? Category 1 and Category 2 storms remain roughly constant. Category 3 storms nearly double in frequency, from 6 per year to 10 per year along western North America. Category 4 storms quadruple, from 0.7 to 3.2 storms annually. Category 5 storms increase from roughly 1 per decade to 2 per 3 years, a 7-fold increase in frequency. And in February 2025, Higgins and colleagues published findings in geophysical research letters using large ensemble climate models that were even more striking. Extreme AR frequency, the Category 4 and 5 events, could increase by nearly an order of magnitude under mild warming scenarios relative to early 21st century conditions. substantially increases in the percentage of winters experiencing multiple extreme AR events, affecting both California and the Pacific Northwest. The Stanford findings said, when they cluster, damage triples or quadruples. The frequency projection said they are going to cluster more. The combination of those two findings produces a damage trajectory that is not gradual. It is not a slow drift upward. It is what happens when an exponential damage function and an exponential frequency increase are applied to the same system simultaneously. Jack Baker, the senior author of the Stanford study, was direct about the implications. We're going to see more feast or famine conditions, where we have really dry years, and also have years with one atmospheric river after another, as we saw in the 2023 winter. The more we can anticipate the flooding and damage these storms can cause, the more rapidly we can respond. The feast or famine framing is important because it captures the paradox that makes this phenomenon so difficult for public communication to convey. The same atmospheric rivers that destroyed $3 billion of infrastructure in California in early 2023 are responsible for roughly half of California's annual precipitation. They fill the reservoirs. They recharge the snowpack. They are, in their moderate forms, the water system. The Category 1s and 2s are not a problem. The problem is what the Category 4s and 5s are becoming. How frequent, how clustered, how exponentially more destructive than anything the infrastructure was designed to handle. But here's what the sequence of research and the damage projections do not capture at all. They assume the storms arrive where they have historically arrived. They assume the Pacific Northwest and California and the European Atlantic coast are still the targets. They assume the Category 5 events are striking communities that at least have levee systems, reservoir management protocols, and emergency management infrastructure calibrated to this type of flooding. What they do not assume, what the most consequential finding of the past year of atmospheric river research actually documents, is that these systems are moving. The rivers in the sky are drifting toward the poles, and the communities they are drifting toward have none of the infrastructure I just described. In October 2024, the journal Science Advances published a study by Jay Lee and Qinghua Ding of the University of California at Santa Barbara that documented something that had been suspected in the modeling literature for years, but had not been conclusively measured in the observational record. Atmospheric rivers have shifted poleward by approximately 6 to 10 degrees in both hemispheres over the past 4 decades. 6 to 10 degrees of latitude in both hemispheres simultaneously. To understand what that means concretely, you need to know where atmospheric rivers have historically concentrated. The classic pattern places peak activity in the extratropics, the band between roughly 30 and 50 degrees north and south. This is where the jet stream lives, where the polar and tropical air masses meet, where the moisture corridors form and travel. 30 degrees north is the latitude of Los Angeles, New Orleans, Cairo. 50 degrees north is the latitude of London, Vancouver, Kiev. The heavy AR activity has historically occupied the band between those two lines. What Lee and Ding found is that the activity has shifted upward. In both hemispheres, atmospheric river frequency has increased along 50 degrees north and 50 degrees south over the past 4 decades, while decreasing along 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. The rivers are moving away from the subtropical zone and toward the higher latitudes. In North America, that means more atmospheric rivers targeting British Columbia, Alaska, and the inland valleys of the Pacific Northwest that have no managed flood infrastructure. Fewer reaching California and the Southwest, which already depend on atmospheric rivers for roughly half their annual precipitation. In Europe, it means more AR activity targeting Scotland and Scandinavia and the high latitude Atlantic coast, while the Iberian Peninsula and Mediterranean regions, which depend heavily on AR rainfall for reservoir replenishment and agricultural water supply, receive less. The drought-flood paradox in a single measurement, the regions that need the water are getting less of it. The regions that are least prepared for the water are getting more. And the poleward migration interacts with the intensification trend in a way that compounds the risk beyond either factor alone. When an intensifying atmospheric river arrives in a region that has historically received ARs, California, Oregon, Western Europe, It arrives where levees have been built, where reservoir operators have developed protocols, where emergency management systems have been calibrated to exactly this type of event. The infrastructure is still frequently overwhelmed, but it exists. When an intensifying atmospheric river arrives in a region where ARs are occurring with historically unprecedented frequency, northern British Columbia, the inland Pacific Northwest, parts of the high latitude Atlantic coast, it arrives where none of that infrastructure exists. The December 2025 Washington State event was instructive in this regard. 5 stream gauges at record levels, 16 at major flood stage, a 49-mile stretch of a primary highway closed for months. And Washington State is not an unprotected region. It has flood management infrastructure, reservoir systems, and emergency management capability. The question the data raises is what happens as the poleward shift pushes similar events into the corridors north and inland of the existing infrastructure envelope. But the poleward shift is only one dimension of what is changing about these systems. The other dimension is where their moisture is coming from. NASA tracked the December 2025 Washington System's moisture corridor back to its origin point, approximately 7,000 miles away near the Philippines. That is not a Pacific Northwest atmospheric river in any historical sense. That is a transoceanic moisture pipeline stretching from subtropical Asia to the northwestern corner of the United States, carrying 5 trillion gallons of water across the breadth of the largest ocean on Earth before releasing it against the Cascade Mountains in a 4-day event that set 5 stream gauge records. The ARLID system, the Global Atmospheric River Life Cycle Detection Database, published in Scientific Data in December 2025 by Kearns and Chen, is the first database capable of tracking individual atmospheric rivers from their formation through their full life cycle and landfall. It incorporates both integrated vapor transport and total precipitable water across a 44-year record. Among the things it is beginning to document is the increasing reach of these systems, how far from their moisture sources they are drawing vapor, how far from their formation zones they are traveling before landfall. The atmospheric rivers of 2025 are not the atmospheric rivers of 1981. They are reaching farther back into the tropics for their moisture. They are arriving with more of it, and they are arriving somewhere different. The sky above the traditional AR corridors of the Pacific coast has been the subject of decades of infrastructure investment and emergency management planning. The sky above the high latitude and interior regions where these systems are increasingly landing has not. That gap between where the rivers were and where they are going is the infrastructure story of the next several decades. But before this investigation can follow the full implications of that gap, there is another phenomenon that has been crossing the Atlantic simultaneously. Something that has been mistaken for benign haze, for unusual sunsets, for a fertilizer system for the Amazon. Something that is, in fact, all of those things, and also something else entirely. Something that a laboratory in Texas spent 4 years of sampling to begin characterizing. And what they found is that the wall of dust crossing the ocean above us is not empty. It is alive. Every summer, beginning in late spring and running through early autumn, a mass of hot, dry, dusty air rises from the Sahara Desert into the atmosphere. It rises every 3 to 5 days, according to NOAA, forming what researchers call the Saharan air layer, a distinct meteorological structure that sits above the marine boundary layer of the tropical Atlantic, riding over the cooler, moist air at the surface, carried westward by the trade winds. At peak intensity, this structure can reach altitudes of up to 20,000 feet. It can span an area comparable to the lower 48 United States, and it travels from the west coast of North Africa across the full width of the tropical Atlantic to the Caribbean, the Gulf Coast, sometimes as far as the interior of North America and the basin of the Amazon rainforest. Joseph Prospero is an emeritus professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Miami Rosenstiel School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science. He is the scientist who discovered the Saharan air layer, not as a theoretical construct, but as an observable, measurable phenomenon that he began tracking from a monitoring station on Barbados more than 50 years ago. That station has now accumulated one of the longest continuous records of transatlantic dust transport in the world. It is the baseline against which everything else in this story is measured. Here is what that 50-year baseline shows. The annual volume of dust leaving the North African coast is approximately 179 million tons. 179 million tons. Of that, roughly 102 million tons deposit into the tropical Atlantic Ocean. 20 million tons deposit over the Caribbean Sea, and 27.7 million tons, enough to fill 104,908 semi-trucks, fall to the surface over the Amazon basin. Hongbin Yu is an atmospheric scientist at the University of Maryland who works at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Using 8 years of data from the Calypso satellite, the Cloud Aerosol Lidar and Infrared Pathfinder satellite observation instrument, launched in 2006, Yu and his team provided the first three-dimensional, multi-year estimate of this dust transport and its composition. Published in Geophysical Research Letters in 2015, their finding about the Amazon connection became one of the most striking demonstrations of planetary scale atmospheric linkage in modern Earth science. 22,000 tons of phosphorus are delivered from the Sahara to the Amazon every year. That number, 22,000 tons, is approximately equal to the amount of phosphorus that the Amazon loses annually from its soils through rainfall and flooding. The Amazon rainforest, the most biodiverse ecosystem on Earth, depends on the Sahara Desert to replace the nutrients that its own rain washes away. The connection between the world's largest hot desert and the world's largest tropical rainforest is not ecological poetry. It is a measured, quantified, instrument-verified nutrient transfer that has been sustaining equatorial forest productivity across the full breadth of the Atlantic Ocean. The dust originates primarily from the Bodel Depression in Chad, an ancient lake bed that once contained a massive freshwater body called Lake Megachad. When that lake receded thousands of years ago, it left behind sediment loaded with the fossilized remains of freshwater microorganisms. Diatoms, mostly, that had been accumulating in the lake for millennia. Those remains are rich in phosphorus, silicon, and other nutrients. When the winds of the Sahara lift dust from the Bodel Depression, they are not lifting inert mineral particles. They are lifting the compressed biological record of an ancient ecosystem, grinding it fine, and sending it across an ocean to feed a living one. That is the benign face of Saharan dust transport. The fertilizer function, the planetary circulatory system at its most elegant and interconnected. But the benign face is not the whole story. And the event that revealed how far outside the benign category this phenomenon can reach occurred in June 2020, and it was large enough that researchers gave it a name. They called it Godzilla. The June 2020 Saharan dust plume was the most intense transatlantic dust event recorded in the 20-year MODIS satellite archive. The data, analyzed by Yu and colleagues in a comprehensive study published in Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics in 2021, showed aerosol optical depth, essentially a measure of how opaque the dust column was to satellite observation, peaking at 3.5 off the coast of West Africa. In the Caribbean, the AOD was 1.8. The plume traveled approximately 8,000 kilometers across the Atlantic. It reached altitudes of 6 to 8 kilometers over West Africa and descended to roughly 4 kilometers over the Caribbean. In certain locations over the Atlantic Ocean, its thickness was double what had ever been recorded during the month of June since the satellite record began in 1995. Double. The entire history of June's observations at that location, going back 25 years, had never produced a plume half as thick as what crossed the Atlantic in June 2020. Amato Evan is an atmospheric scientist at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He led the research team that analyzed what created the conditions for the Godzilla event. Their study, published in Geophysical Research Letters in December 2020, traced the cause to an anomalous positioning of the North Atlantic subtropical high, the high-pressure system off the African coast, whose clockwise circulation drives dust westward. In June 2020, The geopotential heights associated with that system were 80 meters above the 1980 to 2020 climatology. That anomaly intensified the African easterly jet, a jet stream sitting approximately 5 kilometers above the Sahara, which then rapidly transported the dust toward the Caribbean and the southern United States. The plume arrived in the Caribbean on June 22nd. By June 23rd, the Puerto Rico Air Quality Monitoring Network recorded a maximum daily PM10 concentration of 453 micrograms per cubic meter. The World Health Organization guideline for PM10 is 45 micrograms per cubic meter for 24-hour mean concentrations. Puerto Rico's air on June 23rd was registering 10 times that guideline value. Air quality in the Caribbean basin was degraded to hazardous levels. By June 25th, the plume had reached the Gulf Coast of the United States, lending a hazy brown tint to skies across multiple states and triggering air quality alerts from Florida to Texas. More than 70 air quality measurement stations in the southeastern United States exceeded the EPA standard on June 26th and 27th, a plume 5,000 miles wide, reaching 20,000 feet, carrying dust at 10 times the WHO limit for what human lungs can safely encounter, crossing 8,000 kilometers of open ocean at 15 meters per second, arriving in 9 days. That is the scale of the physical phenomenon. But what the air quality numbers measured was the mineral fraction of the dust, the visible fraction, the fraction that science has been tracking for 50 years because it scatters light, absorbs solar radiation, and changes the temperature of the ocean surface. The biological fraction, what was living inside that dust, what had survived that 9-day transoceanic crossing at altitude, that took a different kind of laboratory to characterize. And when Texas A&M did it, what they found was not what anyone in public health communications was prepared to discuss. Dr. Shankar Chelam is a professor in the Zachary Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Texas A&M University, where he holds the A.P. and Florence Wiley Professorship. His research focus is water quality and air quality, the chemistry and biology of what moves through the systems that humans depend on for survival. In 2018, when a Saharan dust event crossed the Atlantic and arrived in Houston, Chelam and his team were ready for it. They had been waiting. What followed was 4 years of laboratory analysis that produced in 2023 a paper in Environmental Science and Technology that the authors themselves described as the first of its kind, the first simultaneous measurements of the elemental and microbial composition of North American respirable airborne particulate matter during a Saharan-Sahelian dust event. No one had done both at the same time before, in the same location, using the same air samples. The research team, which included Chelam's former student Dr. Sourav Das and Dr. Daniel Spelink, the director of the S.M. Tracy Herbarium at Texas A&M, used 16S, 18S, and ITSR DNA sequencing. The same molecular tools used to identify unknown organisms in soil and water, to generate comprehensive taxonomic and phylogenetic profiles of the microbial communities they found in the dust. Over 2,000 different organic groups were detected in the Houston air samples during the sampling period. 2,000. Of those, 17 increased in abundance, specifically as the Saharan dust entered the city, not before, not after, during the dust intrusion. 17 groups that tracked with the arrival of the African plume. Among the genera identified, Staphylococcus, Bacillus, Escherichia, Sphingomonas, Deinococcus, Streptomyces, Rubella microbium, Caistobacter, Rothia. Take a moment with some of those names. Staphylococcus is described in the study as a leading nosocomial pathogen, hospital-acquired infection. It is the genus that contains methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, better known as MRSA, which the World Health Organization classifies as a high-priority antibiotic-resistant pathogen. It has been identified in Saharan dust and documented as a component of the desert soil and dust microbiome. Bacillus is both an animal and plant pathogen, ubiquitous in desert environments and Saharan dust samples globally. Escherichia The genus that includes E. coli has been identified in African dust events arriving in southern Spain and in samples collected in Mali. Dinococcus is not primarily pathogenic, but is notable for something else. It is one of the most radiation-resistant organisms known to science. It survives conditions that would be lethal to virtually every other known organism. It has been found in Saharan dust samples, which raises the question of what kind of selection pressure a 9-day, 20,000-foot UV-exposed transoceanic crossing applies to the biological community inside the plume. Radiation resistance is not a random trait. It is adaptive. Separately, a study published in EOS in 2022 covered the work of Marone and colleagues, who directly measured bacteria on dust collected in Senegal, Western Africa during transit, and identified at high concentrations 2 species that are of particular clinical concern: Burkholderia cepacia and Pseudomonas aeruginosa. These gram-positive bacteria are listed by pulmonologists as particularly dangerous for individuals with cystic fibrosis and other chronic lung conditions, where they can establish persistent, difficult-to-eradicate infections. And a 2024 study published in Applied Sciences analyzed Kalima events, Saharan dust arrivals, in the Canary Islands between 2021 and 2022, isolating and characterizing 23 culturable microorganisms by molecular sequencing. Among them, Acinetobacter lewafii, a pathogenic strain involved in human infections, particularly in immunodeficient patients, and the same organism identified in Saharan dust samples collected in Greece. Nealia circulans, which causes infections in immunodeficient patients. Micrococcus luteus, Enterobacter cancerogenous, and Pseudoscherichia vulneris, all opportunistic pathogens capable of causing human infections. The DNA of all of these organisms was present in Saharan dust events crossing the Atlantic and arriving in North America and Europe. Now, the caveat. The caveat that the honest researcher insists on, and that the honest investigation must present with equal weight to the findings themselves. It doesn't tell us if they're going to be able to infect us and make us sick, said Daniel Spalink. But at least the DNA of several pathogenic bacteria and fungi were identified in the African dust. DNA is not viability. The detection of genetic material does not confirm that an organism is alive. It does not confirm that it is capable of reproduction. It does not confirm that it would survive the conditions of a human respiratory tract well enough to establish infection. The molecular sequencing techniques used by Chellam's team are extraordinarily sensitive. They can detect genetic fragments from organisms that are long dead, desiccated, inert. The finding is real and significant. The interpretation requires precision. What the data establishes is this: the genetic signatures of multiple organisms on the World Health Organization's lists of global priority human pathogens have been detected in Saharan dust arriving in North America. The viability of those organisms, whether they survived the crossing, whether they remained infectious upon arrival, is the open question. It is a question the field is actively working to answer. It is not a question that has been answered. Chellam's own framing of future research needs is revealing. Longer-term measurements, including microbial viability, the oxidative potential of bioaerosols in conjunction with metals, the possibility that metals and microbes together could generate reactive oxygen species, considered a good indicator of toxicity. These are the next chapter of this investigation. They are not complete. What is complete, what is documented, published, and peer-reviewed is the inventory. The dust above Houston in 2018 contained the DNA of organisms that, if viable, would represent genuine clinical concern. The dust above the Czech Republic in 2024 drove PM10 values 6 to 8 times above normal and exceeded WHO guidelines by up to 2 times. The dust above the Canary Islands in 2021 and 2022 was growing bacteria in laboratory culture. The dust above southern Spain has been documented to contain Escherichia strains. The question of what is alive inside the plume is the question science is racing to answer before the next Godzilla-scale event delivers it to a population center and forces the answer to become clinical rather than academic. But the biological inventory is only part of what the dust carries. The other part is chemical, and the chemistry interacts with the biology in ways that are only beginning to be mapped. When the Sahara sends its plumes across the Atlantic, the mineral matrix of those plumes is dominated by silicates: silicon, aluminum, iron, calcium, magnesium, potassium. These are the expected compounds of crustal rock weathered by millennia of wind erosion. They scatter sunlight, they seed clouds, they deliver iron and phosphorus to ocean ecosystems that depend on those nutrients. This is the beneficial side of the chemical freight. But Saharan dust does not travel alone through the atmosphere. During its multi-day transit from source region to deposition point, it passes through some of the most industrially active airspace on the planet. The Saharan source regions themselves, particularly the margins of the Sahara in the Sahel and adjacent areas, have been subject to decades of agricultural and mining activity that has introduced anthropogenic trace elements into the soil. And the dust is a collector. Whatever it encounters aloft, it can absorb and carry. A review published in PMC in late 2024, led by Gorgat Kopulu and colleagues, characterizes the chemical composition of Saharan dust in clinical terms. Trace elements detected in Saharan dust include heavy metals, lead, cadmium, and zinc from both natural geological sources and anthropogenic activities within and around the source region. These are not trace detections at analytical sensitivity limits. These are elements that, at elevated concentrations, have documented toxicological profiles in human respiratory tissue. The pathway matters. Particles smaller than 10 micrometers in aerodynamic diameter, the PM10 fraction, can enter the lower respiratory tract. Particles below 2.5 micrometers, the PM2.5 fraction, can reach the bronchi and cause chronic bronchitis and asthma. Particles below 0.1 micrometers, submicron particles, can penetrate from the alveoli directly into the bloodstream and be transported to other organs. Saharan dust events produce particles across all three size fractions. The Czech Republic study, published in Scientific Reports in December 2024, examined the impact of the late March to early April 2024 Saharan dust event across Central Europe, one of the largest recorded Saharan intrusions into continental Europe in recent years. Their measurement, PM10 concentrations during the event, were 6 to 8 times higher than under normal atmospheric conditions. 6 to 8 times. And they exceeded WHO air quality guidelines by up to 2 times. Scanning electron microscopy with energy dispersive spectroscopy confirmed the sizes and elemental compositions of the individual dust particles. The study also noted something that connects the chemical and biological inventories in a clinically relevant way. Some of the microorganisms attached to dust particles can survive and be viable in local ecosystems where the aerosols are deposited. The highly resistant microbial communities documented by other researchers, including organisms like Deinococcus, the radiation-resistant extremophile in the Houston samples, have the physical characteristics associated with survival in harsh environments. The dust particle itself provides a protective substrate for microbial attachment. The mineral surface can act as a transport medium that partially shields organic material from UV degradation during the crossing. Das and Chellam's work at Texas A&M specifically identified the oxidative potential interaction. Metals combined with bioaerosols in respirable particulate matter could generate reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species are highly reactive molecules that damage cellular components. DNA, proteins, lipid membranes. They are used as a standard indicator of particulate matter toxicity in respiratory health research. The finding is not that Saharan dust is definitively generating these species at dangerous concentrations in the regions it reaches. The finding is that the combination of metal content and biological material that has been documented in Saharan dust events creates the chemical conditions under which reactive oxygen species generation is possible. The 50-year monitoring record from Barbados, Prospero's original dataset, has now confirmed something that was only suspected in earlier decades. Climate change has contributed to changes in both the quantity of Saharan dust transported and the concentrations of certain inorganic species within it. The dust is not a static phenomenon. Its composition and volume respond to changes in Saharan surface conditions, Sahel rainfall patterns, and atmospheric circulation, all of which are being modified by the same thermal forcing that is loading atmospheric rivers with more moisture. Chronic exposure to Saharan dust particles, the kind of exposure experienced by populations in the Canary Islands, the Iberian Peninsula, the Mediterranean, and increasingly the Caribbean and southeastern United States during major plume events, leads to sustained respiratory inflammation. Airway remodeling, epithelial hyperplasia, mucus hypersecretion, fibrosis. These are the documented physiological consequences of long-term exposure to fine particulate matter with the mineral and chemical composition of Saharan dust, as characterized in the 2024 Georgopoulou Review. The picture that emerges from the combined chemical and biological characterization is one that the field has been reluctant to frame in public health terms because the viability question remains unanswered, but the individual components are documented separately. The metals are there, the pathogen DNA is there, the respiratory inflammation pathway is documented. The reactive oxygen species interaction is hypothesized with a mechanism. The missing piece is viability, whether the organisms survive the crossing alive and infectious. That piece is the subject of active research, and while that research continues, the dust events are not waiting. They are arriving, they are intensifying, and the mechanism that has historically buffered their most catastrophic possible interaction, hurricane formation over a warming Atlantic, is showing signs of breaking down in ways that one of the world's leading atmospheric scientists described as requiring a complete reevaluation. Jason Dunyan is a meteorologist at NOAA's Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory. He studies how the Saharan air layer interacts with developing tropical weather systems in the Atlantic. In June 2025, as a mass of Saharan dust completed its 5,000-mile crossing and arrived over South Florida, Dunyan described the mechanism of how that dust suppresses hurricane formation. He called it a trifecta. The first mechanism is dryness. The Saharan air layer is extremely dry air, by definition because it originates over the world's largest hot desert. When this dry layer rides above the moist marine air of the tropical Atlantic, it creates an environment fundamentally hostile to the convective processes that hurricanes require. Developing tropical storms depend on deep columns of moist air that can fuel the convective towers through which heat is released and organized rotation begins. Dry air intrusion from above disrupts those columns. The storm reaches for the moisture it needs and finds dry Saharan air instead. The convective towers weaken. The organizing process stalls. The second mechanism is wind shear. At the boundary between the Saharan air layer above and the marine layer below, the trade winds create a zone of intense vertical wind shear, a rapid change in wind speed and direction with altitude. Vertical wind shear is lethal to developing hurricanes. It tilts the warm core of the developing storm, displaces the convective elements from the center of circulation, and prevents the organized rotation from deepening into a coherent tropical cyclone. A storm that might otherwise intensify finds itself structurally disrupted at the moment of its formation. The third mechanism is the temperature inversion itself. The Saharan air layer absorbs solar radiation and remains warm. This creates what meteorologists call a thermal inversion, a layer of warm air sitting above cooler air, which is the exact opposite of the normal atmospheric structure that supports deep convective development. Warm air above, cool air below, stability. The storm cannot break through the lid. The Saharan air layer is very warm, and all the dust in the layer absorbs solar energy. Dunyan said, "It's that process that keeps the layer warm, and anytime you have warm air hiding in the upper atmosphere, it's almost like a lid that makes it hard for clouds to break through." Three mechanisms simultaneously. dryness, shear, inversion. Any one of them at sufficient magnitude can suppress a developing storm. Together, they represent what Dunyan called a trifecta of atmospheric processes that can shut down tropical storm development across the Atlantic basin. And there is a fourth mechanism operating at a longer time scale: dust cooling of sea surface temperatures. Large amounts of dust suspended above the tropical Atlantic reflect sunlight back to space before it can reach the ocean surface. The evidence, compiled across multiple studies, suggests that during periods of heavy dust transport, sea surface temperatures in the hurricane main development region, the zone from the West African coast to the Caribbean, where most Atlantic storms form, can be up to 1 degree Celsius cooler than average. 1 degree sounds small. In terms of hurricane energy availability, 1 degree Celsius of SST difference is meaningful. Cooler ocean surface means less evaporation, less latent heat, less energy available for storm intensification. The historical record supports this mechanism. Researchers have documented that decades of relatively high dust transport across the Atlantic, particularly the period of enhanced Saharan dust output in the 1970s and 1980s, driven by Sahel drought conditions, coincided with a notable downturn in Atlantic hurricane activity. The dust was acting as a seasonal, continent-scale climate intervention, unintentional, unmanaged, but measurably effective. This is the framework within which the summer of 2020 should have played out. The largest Saharan dust event in the 2-decade satellite record. Aerosol optical depth of 3.5 off the African coast. PM10 at 453 micrograms per cubic meter in Puerto Rico. A Saharan air layer so thick that in some Atlantic locations it was double any June measurement since 1995. Under the established theory, this should have been one of the quietest hurricane seasons in modern memory. The dust was everywhere. The suppression mechanisms were all engaged. Instead, 2020 produced one of the most active Atlantic hurricane seasons on record. 30 named storms, a record that stood among the busiest in history. Storms that should have been suppressed, formed, and intensified. The machinery that was supposed to prevent them was operating, and it failed to deliver the expected result. Amato Evan at Scripps did not minimize the contradiction. While there is a large body of evidence suggesting that increased dust suspended over the Atlantic can reduce the numbers of tropical cyclones there, primarily through dust-induced cooling of ocean surface temperature, he said, this year we observed the largest dust storm on record, as well as one of the most active hurricane seasons on record. Either 2020 is just a year where everything is upside down, or we really need to reevaluate our understanding of how dust impacts that climate system. Evan and his colleague, Diana Francis, a senior research scientist at the Khalifa University of Science and Technology in the UAE, had analyzed what created the conditions for Godzilla itself. The anomalous high-pressure positioning that drove the African easterly jet to unusual intensification showed structural similarities to patterns observed in 2010, a year when Arctic sea ice was at a substantially reduced extent. The possibility that declining Arctic sea ice, through changes in high-latitude atmospheric circulation, was contributing to the formation conditions of extreme Saharan dust events, added another layer of interconnection to the climate system that standard models had not fully incorporated. The trifecta that kills hurricanes failed in 2020. The largest dust event in the satellite record arrived simultaneously with one of the busiest storm seasons in that same record. The researcher who knows the system most deeply said the relationship requires reevaluation. And this is where the story takes a turn that most people following atmospheric science coverage have not fully encountered. Because the hurricane paradox of 2020 is not just an anomaly in the dust-hurricane relationship. It is a signal about what happens when two intensifying atmospheric phenomena, the moisture loading of the Atlantic and the biological chemical loading of the Saharan dust system, interact in ways that the models describing each phenomenon individually were not designed to predict. The atmosphere above the tropical and subtropical Atlantic is not a single-layer phenomenon. It is a stack. From the surface upward, the warm, moist marine boundary layer, where sea surface temperatures drive evaporation and fuel convective development. Above that, during summer months, the Saharan air layer, the hot, dry, dust-laden mass that rides westward at altitude. And above that, the broader atmospheric circulation, the trade winds, the jet streams, the long wave ridges and troughs that organize everything below them into the weather patterns that determine what lands on the surface. Atmospheric rivers are creatures of the upper parts of that stack. They form in the mid to upper troposphere, organized by jet stream dynamics, carrying moisture from the tropics toward the poles, in the corridors where the polar and tropical air masses interact. Saharan dust plumes travel in the middle of the stack, in and above the marine boundary layer, below the upper level circulation that would ultimately steer them. For most of the history of research on these two phenomena, they have been studied as separate systems. Atmospheric river science developed primarily in the Pacific, focused on California water supply and West Coast flooding. Saharan dust science developed primarily in the Atlantic, focused on air quality, hurricane dynamics, and Amazon fertilization. The two communities published in overlapping but distinct bodies of literature. The phenomena were real. The interaction between them was largely uncharacterized. That is beginning to change. The Atmospheric River Tracking Method. Intercomparison Project, ARTMIP, is the most comprehensive effort ever undertaken to standardize the detection and classification of atmospheric rivers globally. Its Tier 2 dataset, used in the March 2025 Journal of Climate Study that documented AR area, expansion, and moistening over the past 4 decades, includes something that was not a standard analytical category when the project began: a classification of atmospheric rivers by their dust content. Dusty atmospheric rivers. Events in which mineral dust transport is integrated into the atmospheric moisture corridor itself. The physical pathway for this interaction is well established in the cloud physics literature. Saharan dust particles are effective cloud condensation nuclei and ice nuclei. They provide the surfaces upon which water vapor condenses to form cloud droplets and ice crystals. The size and composition of dust particles makes them particularly effective nuclei for certain types of ice formation in the upper portions of deep convective systems. When Saharan dust is present within or adjacent to an intensifying atmospheric river, it changes the microphysics of the precipitation process inside that AR. More condensation nuclei available in a given air mass generally means more but smaller droplets, which can alter precipitation efficiency, change where and how intensely rain falls, and modify the energy release that organizes and sustains the moisture corridor itself. Diana Francis and her colleagues demonstrated in a 2024 study in Geophysical Research Letters that the radiative effects of Saharan dust can amplify the mid-level ridge over the central Atlantic through temperature perturbation, actually changing the tracks of tropical cyclones. The dust doesn't just suppress storms, it repositions them. It alters the pressure gradients that determine where moisture transport is directed. In a warmer, moister atmosphere, the atmosphere that the 2025 moisture transport record describes, both effects are likely amplified. More moisture in the atmospheric river means more latent heat release, stronger pressure gradients, more energetic moisture corridors. More Saharan dust in the same air mass means more active cloud microphysics, modified precipitation efficiency, and altered ridge amplification. The interaction is not the sum of two independent processes. It is a coupled system with feedback potential that the field is only beginning to map. Francis's 2024 study of the April 2023 Middle East atmospheric river introduced another feature of this interaction that deserves attention. The event produced IVT values of 1,176 kilograms per meter per second, in the top 1% of the entire climatological distribution for the Arabian Peninsula. Inside that atmospheric river, the high-resolution WRF model simulation at 2.5 kilometer resolution revealed the presence of what Francis and her colleagues called atmospheric river rapids. Narrow convective structures, 5 to 7 kilometers deep, only 5 to 15 kilometers wide, propagating at speeds above 30 meters per second. These structures produced precipitation rates exceeding 4 millimeters per hour and could last more than 24 hours. Atmospheric river rapids are not a theoretical construct. They were observed within an event that itself was in the top 1% of the climatological record for an entire region, and the study noted explicitly, in a warming climate with increased atmospheric water vapor, AR rapids may be even more destructive. The compound machine works like this. Rising ocean temperatures load atmospheric rivers with more moisture under a thermodynamic law that is precise to about 7% per degree Celsius of warming. Those same rising temperatures alter the sea surface temperature gradients that determine Saharan air layer behavior and transport efficiency. A warming Sahel and northern Sahara produce changes in surface vegetation and soil moisture that alter dust emission rates, sometimes increasing them, sometimes decreasing them, in ways that are highly sensitive to Sahel rainfall variability. The dust that is emitted modifies cloud microphysics inside atmospheric rivers it encounters, potentially altering where precipitation falls. It modifies surface temperature gradients that can stall or redirect moisture corridors. And the disruption of the hurricane suppression relationship, documented in 2020 but not fully explained, means that the storms that dust historically suppressed may be increasingly able to form and intensify in a moisture-rich Atlantic environment, potentially coupling with the poleward shifting AR moisture corridors in new ways. This is not a simple linear system. It is a set of interacting feedbacks, some reinforcing and some opposing, that the scientific community is working to characterize under conditions that have no historical analog in the observational record. The records from 2024 and 2025 that the Washington Post documented are not a backdrop to this investigation. They are the signal that the compound machine is producing outputs the models have not yet fully captured.
And the consequences of that compound output are not theoretical either. There is a specific documented clinical example of what happens when intensifying dust transport and shifting precipitation patterns interact in populated environments. It is happening right now in real time across the western United States, and it involves an organism that has been hiding in plain sight in the soil for as long as the climate has been favorable, waiting for the conditions to spread.
In the soil of the southwestern United States, there lives a fungus called coccidioides. It grows in hot, dry earth, in the kind of soil that forms in the deserts of Arizona and California, where temperatures exceed what most organisms can tolerate and rainfall is measured in inches per year. The fungus has a life cycle adapted precisely to the feast or famine climate of its environment. It grows actively during periods of moisture, extending long filamentous strands through the soil. Then, when the drought returns, when the heat reasserts itself and the soil desiccates, those filaments fragment. They break apart into tiny spores called arthroconidia, each one about 2 to 5 micrometers in diameter, small enough to remain airborne for hours, small enough to reach the deepest regions of the human lung when inhaled. When those spores enter a human respiratory system, the disease they cause is called coccidioidomycosis. It is more commonly known as valley fever. From 1998 to 2015, valley fever cases in the United States increased by 400%. In California alone, cases increased fivefold between 2001 and 2021. From 1999 to 2019, an average of 200 Americans died from valley fever every year, a mortality rate that fluctuates with environmental conditions rather than tracking any medical intervention because there is no vaccine, and the antifungal medications available are effective primarily in preventing severe dissemination rather than eliminating established infection. The fungus has been found in Washington state, not on the Oregon border. In Washington state, a region that, for most of the history of valley fever research, was considered too wet and too cold for coccidioides to establish. The climate envelope models that define the endemic region were built on data from Arizona and California, where the fungus had been present for as long as the disease had been described. Washington state was outside that envelope. Then the fungus turned up in the soil there, viable and present. Morgan Goris is an Earth system scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory. She has been studying valley fever for 7 years, modeling the relationship between climate conditions and the geographic spread of the pathogen. Her projections, published in GeoHealth in 2019 and updated in subsequent work, are among the most cited in the field. Under a high greenhouse gas emission scenario, Goris's model finds that the area of climate-limited endemicity for coccidioides will more than double by the end of this century. The number of affected states increases from 12 to 17. The number of valley fever cases increases by 50%. And the endemic region expands northward in a pattern that Goris described in direct terms. The endemic region for valley fever expands through the whole western United States and ends up touching the U.S.-Canadian border. The U.S.-Canadian border, not the Arizona-California corridor, the Pacific Northwest, the Intermountain West, the high desert margins of Idaho and South Dakota, regions that have historically had no valley fever awareness among their medical communities, no training for primary care physicians to consider it as a differential diagnosis, no epidemiological surveillance calibrated to detect its emergence. The mechanism connecting valley fever to this investigation is not incidental. It is direct. Atmospheric rivers create the wet-dry cycle that coccidioides thrives in. An intense AR delivers heavy precipitation to the southwest, saturating soil and producing the moisture conditions under which the fungus grows rapidly, extending its filamentous network through newly wetted earth. Then the normal post-AR drying cycle begins. The soil heats up, the moisture evaporates, the fungal strands desiccate and fragment. The spores become airborne, and the same wind patterns that follow an atmospheric river event, the dry offshore flow, the thermally driven dust lift, pick those spores up and carry them. The spores can drift up to 75 miles from where the wind first disturbed the soil. This is not a theoretical connection. No AA documented that dust storms in the U.S. Southwest more than doubled over 2 decades, from 20 recorded events in 1988 to 48 in 2011. The American Lung Association, citing NOAA data, identified the surge in dust storms as among the strongest explanatory factors for the rise in valley fever cases, as the same events that aerosolize soil particulate matter also aerosolize fungal spores. And a 2024 review in the journal Science of the Total Environment confirmed explicitly that the intensification of natural hazard events like dust storms and drought, both of which are being amplified by the same climate dynamics driving atmospheric river behavior, is correlated with greater prevalence of valley fever. The feedback loop works in both directions. Intensifying atmospheric rivers create more intense wet pulses, driving more fungal growth. The subsequent drought, amplified by the same atmospheric dynamics that produce feast or famine precipitation patterns, drives more complete desiccation, producing more spore aerosolization. And the poleward shift of atmospheric rivers is delivering those wet pulses to new regions, regions whose soils may already harbor dormant coccidioids populations that have been waiting for precisely the moisture signal that would trigger growth. Eastern Washington is the example. The fungus found there was not blown in from Phoenix on a particular wind event. The genetic analysis suggests it had been present in the soil, dormant, waiting for conditions that became favorable as the climate warmed and the wet-dry cycle that the fungus requires began reaching that latitude. The atmospheric rivers that are now targeting the Pacific Northwest with increasing frequency are providing exactly that cycle, moisture pulses followed by drying, to soils in a region where the medical community has no history of recognizing valley fever symptoms and where no surveillance network exists to detect its emergence. The overlap between the poleward migration of atmospheric rivers and the projected northward expansion of coccidioides endemicity is not a coincidence that requires explanation. It is the same forcing, warming temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, intensified drought flood cycling, producing 2 correlated outcomes simultaneously. And valley fever is the outcome science can quantify because the organism is already there, already growing, already killing roughly 200 Americans per year, even in the period before the full force of the projected expansion. What happens when the 30 or 40 or 50 million new Americans living in the projected expanded endemic zone encounter valley fever for the first time, with doctors who have never seen it, with hospitals that carry no antifungal inventory calibrated for disseminated coccidioidomycosis, with public health systems that have allocated none of their surveillance budget to detecting a disease they have no reason to expect, is a question that the projections make inevitable and that current planning makes entirely unprepared for. That is what happens with a fungus the science already knows about. What remains to be established is what happens with the organism science has found in the dust, but has not yet confirmed as viable. The honest assessment of where the science stands requires naming something that is rarely stated plainly in the academic literature, but is visible in the dates on the papers, the first of kind language in the abstracts, and the repeated acknowledgement in study after study that what is needed is more data, longer time series, and systematic monitoring that does not yet exist. The AR Lifecycle Detection Database, the ARLID system, published in Scientific Data in December 2025 by Kearns and Chen at Zenodo, is the first global database capable of tracking individual atmospheric rivers from their formation through their full life cycle and landfall, using both integrated vapor transport and total precipitable water simultaneously. The 44-year record it provides is the most comprehensive tool yet created for understanding how these systems behave. It was published in December 2025. The most complete tool available for monitoring one of the most consequential weather phenomena on Earth was not available until weeks ago. The ARTMIP project, the Atmospheric River Tracking Method, Intercomparison project, has been working to standardize how atmospheric rivers are detected, classified, and compared across different research groups. Its Tier 2 dataset, used in the March 2025 Journal of Climate paper documenting AR area expansion, represents the most rigorous current consensus on AR behavior over the past 4 decades. But a 2025 study in Geophysical Research Letters by Liu and colleagues, one of the first attempts to build an entirely satellite-based AR database rather than relying on atmospheric reanalysis, found that real-world AR frequency in the mid-latitudes appears to be significantly lower than what the standard reanalysis products report. The satellite observations and the model-based reanalysis do not agree on how many atmospheric rivers there are. That disagreement is active and unresolved. For biological monitoring of Saharan dust, the situation is more stark. The Texas A&M study published in Environmental Science and Technology in 2023 was the first simultaneous measurement of elemental and microbial composition of North American respirable air during a Saharan dust event. In the history of Saharan dust research, a field with a 50-year monitoring record on Barbados, with satellite observation going back to 1995, with comprehensive trajectory modeling and radiative transfer characterization, the first study examining what microbes the dust was carrying to North American cities was published 2 years ago. There is no systematic, continuous monitoring program for the biological composition of Saharan dust events in North America. There is no network of air sampling stations tasked with characterizing microbial content during dust intrusion events. There is no operational public health alert system for at-risk populations. Individuals with compromised immune systems, with chronic lung conditions, with cystic fibrosis, informing them that a biologically characterized dust event is arriving and advising them to reduce outdoor exposure. The Morone study cited in EOS in 2022 suggested that combining bacteriology data with dust transport trajectory modeling might make such an advanced warning system possible. The trajectory analysis that identifies source regions of dust events is already operationally available. NOAA, ECMWF, and National Meteorological Services routinely produce backward trajectory analyses of major dust intrusions. Adding the biological characterization layer to those trajectories, building a profile of what organisms are typical of dust, originating from specific Saharan source regions under specific atmospheric conditions, is technically feasible. The infrastructure for that warning system does not yet exist. Joseph Prospero's Barbados Monitoring Station has been running for more than 50 years. It is one of the most valuable long-term atmospheric chemistry datasets in the world. The biological characterization of the Barbados record, what organisms have been arriving in the dust that has been accumulating in those filters for 50 years, is a largely untapped resource that could provide the historical baseline for understanding how the biological payload of Saharan dust has changed over time, as global warming has altered both source conditions and atmospheric transport. That characterization has barely begun. For atmospheric rivers, the monitoring infrastructure is more developed but still revealing critical gaps. The CW3EAR reconnaissance field campaign deployed 4 instrument operating periods during the December 2025 Washington State event. Research aircraft carrying drops-on instruments that fall through the atmospheric river, transmitting temperature, humidity, wind speed, and pressure data at high vertical resolution. That data is used both for research and for improving operational weather forecasts. The campaign is active, the investment is real. But the satellite-based monitoring discrepancy identified by Liu and colleagues in 2025 raises a fundamental uncertainty. If reanalysis products are overestimating mid-latitude AR frequency compared to what satellite direct observation shows, then the damage models, the frequency projections, and the infrastructure planning documents that are built on reanalysis data are built on a measurement foundation that is still being validated. The tool is being improved even as the phenomenon it is designed to measure accelerates. Christine Shields of UCAR captured the central tension in a single sentence during her commentary for the Washington Post investigation. It doesn't only tell you that there's going to be more moisture in the atmosphere. The IVT increase documents the fuel loading. The AR behavior documentation describes the delivery mechanism. The biological characterization of dust events describes a payload that nobody designed an early warning system for. And the valley fever data describes a pathogen that is already demonstrating what happens when a biologically active soil organism responds to the precipitation dynamics being driven by intensifying atmospheric rivers. The monitoring is improving. The databases are expanding, but the phenomena are not waiting for the monitoring to catch up. They are here now, operating, producing outcomes that are currently being recorded in emergency management reports, hospital admissions data, and insurance loss calculations, rather than in the systematic scientific monitoring that would allow prediction and prevention, rather than retrospective assessment. That gap between what is happening and what is being systematically watched is the context within which the historical record has its most important things to say. There is a lake in Mendocino County, California, called Leonard Lake. It sits in a forested valley approximately 100 miles north of San Francisco, fed by seasonal precipitation in a watershed that has been receiving atmospheric rivers from the Pacific for millennia. Its sediments have been accumulating for thousands of years, layers of material deposited by rainfall and runoff, each year's contribution compressed beneath the weight of everything that followed. A study published in Communications, Earth and Environment in April 2024 examined those sediments across a 3,200-year record. The research team used silicon to aluminum ratios in specific sediment layers and as a proxy for integrated vapor transport, the same IVT metric that CW3E uses in real-time monitoring today, but extended backward through time by the geological record. The correlation between modern instrument-measured IVT values and the silicon aluminum signal in recent sediments was verified, and then the tool was applied to the full historical record. The finding: the late 20th century had the highest median integrated vapor transport since the onset of the medieval climate anomaly. Not since the 1980s, not since the instrumental record began. Since the medieval climate anomaly, a period roughly 1,000 years ago, when temperatures across the northern hemisphere were elevated relative to the preceding and following centuries. The current atmospheric river activity along the California coast, as measured by the observational instruments of 2025, appears to be unprecedented in at least 1,000 years of geological record. But the sediment record also contains a finding that complicates the narrative of the instrumental era as the worst-case scenario. The reconstruction identified pluvial episodes, extended periods of intense precipitation that exceeded anything in the modern meteorological record, with the largest occurring 2 and 3 millennia ago. The atmosphere's capacity to concentrate and deliver moisture along the California coast is demonstrably larger than anything humans have experienced in living memory. The infrastructure systems, the reservoir designs, the levee specifications, the urban drainage networks, all of them were built to manage variability within a range defined by the instrumental record. The geological record says that range is not the system's maximum. Move to the other end of the hemispheric scale. April 2023, the Arabian Peninsula. Diana Francis and colleagues at Khalifa University documented an atmospheric river event over the Arabian Peninsula that registered maximum AVT values of 1,176 kilograms per meter per second, in the top 1% of the climatological distribution for that region. This was not California or Oregon. This was a region that historically receives very little moisture from atmospheric river-type systems. The event produced catastrophic flooding across the UAE and neighboring countries. At the high-resolution simulation level, the event contained those atmospheric river rapids, 5 to 7 kilometer deep convective structures propagating at 30 meters per second, that Francis identified as a previously undercharacterized feature of extreme AR events. The poleward shift, documented by Li and Ding in Science Advances in 2024, is the mechanism connecting the historical California record and the anomalous Arabian Peninsula event. Atmospheric rivers are expanding their reach. The systems that historically concentrated their activity between 30 and 50 degrees north are now reaching into regions, the Arabian Peninsula to the south, the subarctic to the north, that the Leonard Lake sediment record did not capture because they were not historically in the path of these events. And the modeling projections for the near future, the next 25 years, not end-of-century projections, are already showing this signal. A study published in Science Direct in May 2025 examined East Asian atmospheric rivers using high-resolution climate model simulations and found a robust increase in AR frequency and associated precipitation in East Asia for the period 2025 to 2050, not 2100, 2050. ARS projected to become more intense and persistent with a considerable increase in extreme precipitation within the next 2.5 decades. Higgins and colleagues at Geophysical Research Letters, February the 20th to 25, found that extreme AR frequency could increase by nearly an order of magnitude, close to 10 times, under mild warming scenarios relative to early 21st century conditions. The analysis used large ensemble simulations from HADAM4 and CESM2 models. 2. The findings showed substantial increases in the percentage of winters experiencing multiple extreme AR events affecting both California and the Pacific Northwest. Not rare winters. Substantial increases in frequency. And the Higgins study added something that is both more useful and more unsettling than an end-of-century projection. These regimes over the North Pacific can be predicted in the subseasonal to seasonal range, 2 weeks to several months in advance. The atmospheric patterns that set up extreme AR seasons are predictable before the events themselves arrive. That means early warning is theoretically possible. It also means that the failure to have operational early warning systems for biological dust payloads, for compound AR sequence events in poleward shifted regions, and for valley fever emergence in newly endemic territory is a failure of institutional investment rather than a failure of scientific capability. The science knows this is coming. The question is whether the response infrastructure is being built at a pace that matches the acceleration of the phenomena. Before the assessment section of this investigation, there is a category of claims that circulates around both atmospheric river events and unusual Saharan dust arrivals that deserves direct engagement, not dismissal, direct engagement with the physics, because the physics is what distinguishes legitimate investigation from fabricated explanation. The most common fringe claim surrounding extreme weather events in the atmospheric river and dust plume category involves KACI-HARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, a radio research facility in Gacona, Alaska, originally operated by the U.S. Air Force and now managed by the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The claim, which surfaces after nearly every major flooding event and frequently after major Saharan dust intrusions, is that HAARP is being used to manipulate atmospheric conditions, steering storms, creating dust, plumes, or otherwise engineering the weather events this investigation has been documenting. I want to address this directly because it deserves an honest answer grounded in physics, not just dismissal. HAARP's maximum effective radiated power is approximately 3.6 megawatts. That is the total power output of the facility when all antenna elements are operating at full capacity. 3.6 megawatts is a meaningful amount of radio frequency energy for studying the ionosphere, the uppermost layer of the atmosphere, above 100 kilometers altitude, where its signals actually reach. Now consider what the atmospheric river system it is allegedly being used to control actually contains. The energy released by a single major atmospheric river event, the latent heat of condensation from the water vapor that falls as precipitation measured over the storm's lifetime, is measured in petajoules. 1 petajoule is 10 to the power of 15 joules. 3.6 megawatts of continuous operation for 1 year produces approximately 1/10 of 1 petajoule. A Category 3 atmospheric river event releases multiple petajoules of energy during a single multi-day landfall. The ratio between HAARP's power output and the energy content of the atmospheric system it is alleged to control is approximately 9 orders of magnitude. HAARP would need to be 1 billion times more powerful to have meaningful influence on the moisture corridor of an atmospheric river. The physics of energy budgets does not negotiate on this point. The mechanism by which dust plumes are alleged to be manufactured, chemtrail dispersal from high-altitude aircraft, fails on the particle physics. The mineral composition of Saharan dust arriving in North America and Europe has been characterized by Aeronet spectrometers, Calliope LiDAR instruments, and ground-based collection and analysis across multiple continents. It shows crustal mineral signatures consistent with North African geology, silicates, iron oxides, calcium carbonates, diatom fragments from the Bodel Depression. The isotopic signatures of the minerals have been used to trace specific source regions within the Sahara with reasonable precision. Aviation fuel combustion does not produce this mineralogical signature. The trajectory analysis that tracks these plumes back to their source regions, using wind data from multiple independent atmospheric reanalysis products, consistently points to specific Saharan source areas, not to flight corridors. What is actually driving these phenomena is not a secret. The explanation does not require a cover-up. It requires a thermometer. The Clausius-Clapeyron equation is a thermodynamic relationship that describes the exponential increase in water vapor that air can hold as temperature rises. For every 1 degree Celsius of warming, the atmosphere's water-holding capacity increases by approximately 7%. This is not a theory with political implications. It is a measurement of the physical chemistry of water molecules in air derived from first principles in the 19th century. The 12% increase in atmospheric moisture transport since the 1940s that the Washington Post's ERA5 analysis documented is precisely consistent with the observed global temperature increase over that period. The physics predicted it, the measurement confirms it. The poleward shift of atmospheric rivers correlates with sea surface temperature cooling in the eastern tropical Pacific since 2000, a measurable, observable phenomenon captured in multiple independent datasets. The Godzilla dust storm's driving mechanism was an anomalous positioning of the North Atlantic subtropical high at geopotential heights 80 meters above climatology, produced by circulation anomalies that the Francis Evans study connected to Arctic sea ice conditions. Valley fever's northward expansion tracks directly with the warming temperature and drought conditions that the organism's growth requirements predict. The reactive oxygen species potential in Saharan dust, metal bioaerosol combinations, is a laboratory chemistry observation with no electromagnetic component. The real human fingerprint in this story is not a radio transmitter in Alaska. It is 150 years of fossil fuel combustion that has raised atmospheric CO2 concentrations from roughly 280 parts per million in the pre-industrial era to over 420 parts per million today, warming the global average surface temperature by approximately 1.2 degrees Celsius and the ocean surface by a comparable amount. It is land use change in the Sahel that has altered vegetation cover and dust emission dynamics. It is the policy choices about infrastructure investment, monitoring system funding, and public health preparedness that determine whether the communities in the path of intensifying atmospheric rivers and biologically loaded dust plumes have any tools for anticipation. The conspiracy explanation requires a 3.6 megawatt radio transmitter to move a petajoule atmosphere. The physics explanation requires only the consequence of decisions that have been made in plain sight for generations. The ordinary physics is alarming enough. It does not need embellishment, and it does not benefit from the distraction of fabricated mechanisms that redirect attention from the real forcing toward fictional ones.
What the data shows, measured, validated, published in peer-reviewed literature by named scientists at credentialed institutions, is more than sufficient for the honest assessment that follows.
The evidence assembled across this investigation supports three distinct readings of where the atmospheric river and Saharan dust systems stand and where they are heading. All three are grounded in the data that has been presented. All three are held by scientists working in this field, and all three lead to different conclusions about what the next decade will require. Presenting them honestly is the only way to respect both the science and the audience. The first interpretation is the most benign to the current institutional posture, and it deserves to be stated fully and fairly. Under this reading, the trends are real, but the rate of change is manageable within the adaptive capacity of existing and planned systems. The consecutive moisture transport records of 2024 and 2025 represent the early years of a gradual trend, rather than an inflection into a new regime. And the observation that 2 consecutive years broke the record is, statistically, consistent with a trend line rather than an acceleration. The AR5 frequency projection of a 7-fold increase is an end-of-century estimate under high-emission scenarios, and natural climate variability, including the ENSO cycle, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and multi-decade ocean temperature patterns, dominates over decadal timescales in ways that could produce more moderate near-term outcomes than the long-range projections suggest. For the biological payload of Saharan dust, this interpretation points to the viability question as genuinely unresolved. The Texas A&M study found DNA. It did not find viable infectious organisms. The Canary Islands study cultured organisms in laboratory conditions that do not replicate the conditions of a human respiratory system. Valley fever is expanding, but the expansion is tracked, and the disease, while serious, is treatable in most cases. The Amazon-phosphorus relationship remains stable under current dust transport volumes. The hurricane suppression relationship of 2020 is an anomaly whose mechanism is not fully understood, rather than a documented permanent shift. Under this first interpretation, the appropriate response is continued investment in monitoring infrastructure, gradual adaptation of flood management systems to account for trendline changes in AR frequency and intensity, and acceleration of valley fever surveillance and medical training in newly endemic regions. Urgent, but not crisis scale. The second interpretation sits between measured concern and the recognition that current management systems are already showing strain. Under this reading, the poleward shift of atmospheric rivers is not a projected future change. It is already underway and already producing measurable impacts in regions with no flood infrastructure. The 6 to 10 degree poleward shift documented in the leading Science Advances paper is in the observational record, not the model output. The December 2025 Washington State event, 5 trillion gallons, 5 stream gauge records, 49 miles of primary highway closed for months, arrived in a region with some flood infrastructure, and that infrastructure was still overwhelmed in multiple locations. The regions further poleward that are receiving increasing AR activity have less infrastructure, not more. The Stanford sequence finding, 3 to 4 times the damage from back-to-back events, AR5 events, 1,600 times more damaging than Category 1s, is already operating in the current climate before the frequency projections materialize. The insurance models calibrated to historical standalone event damage functions are already demonstrably insufficient for the sequence dynamics that have characterized the most damaging recent events. That is not a future failure mode, it is a current one. For the biological payload, this interpretation holds that the absence of confirmed viability data does not equal the absence of risk. The monitoring infrastructure to detect a population-level health impact from viable airborne pathogens in Saharan dust does not exist in North America. If a biologically active dust event produced a cluster of unusual respiratory infections in a Gulf Coast city, the public health system's ability to attribute that cluster to a Saharan dust event, rather than to seasonal respiratory viruses, local air pollution, or unrelated coincidence, is essentially zero under current surveillance architecture. The absence of documented impact may reflect the absence of monitoring more than the absence of impact. Under this second interpretation, the response required is more urgent. Operational early warning systems for biological dust characterization, rapid expansion of valley fever surveillance and training into newly endemic regions, flood infrastructure investment explicitly calibrated to the sequence event damage multiplier, and insurance and emergency management frameworks that account for the exponential damage function rather than linear approximations. The third interpretation is the one that the compound machine framework points toward most directly, and stating it clearly is not alarmism. It is what the evidence, taken at face value without the moderating assumptions of the first two readings, actually suggests. Under this interpretation, the consecutive moisture transport records of 2024 and 2025 represent the beginning of a regime shift rather than a point on a gradual trend line. The same physical forcing, rising ocean surface temperatures, is simultaneously loading atmospheric rivers, altering Saharan dust transport dynamics, expanding the viable range of dust-associated pathogens like coccidioides, and modifying the hurricane suppression relationship in ways that the 2020 paradox was the first visible signal of. These are not four separate trends converging coincidentally. They are four outputs of a single coupled forcing operating across the same thermodynamic system. When a single forcing drives multiple outputs simultaneously, the outputs interact, and the interaction can produce emergent behaviors that studying any individual output would not predict. The monitoring infrastructure gap named in Part 11 is, under this interpretation, not just an inconvenience or a lag in scientific investment. It is a structural vulnerability in the public health and emergency management architecture at precisely the moment when the phenomena being under-monitored are most likely to produce novel compound events. A Category 5 atmospheric river sequence arriving in a newly endemic valley fever region during a major Saharan dust intrusion represents a compound event that no existing response system was designed to handle. The soil is wet from the AR sequence, creating the fungal growth conditions. The dust arrives carrying biologically characterized pathogen DNA. The dry period following the ARS aerosolizes fungal spores across newly moistened soil, and the public health system in the newly endemic region has no valley fever training, no dust biological monitoring, and no population-level surveillance for the confluence of respiratory outcomes that this combination could produce. This third interpretation does not require certainty about pathogen viability to be operationally concerning. It requires only that the probability of viable pathogens in dust events, which the science has not ruled out, be multiplied against the consequence of their arrival in a newly susceptible population center with no detection or response capability. The expected value of that combination, even under conservative probability assumptions about viability, is not trivially small. What data would distinguish between these three interpretations? The answer is specific and resolvable within a decade if the right investments are made. Longitudinal microbial viability studies of Saharan dust events across multiple years and multiple receptor sites in North America. Systematic comparison of valley fever case clusters with Saharan dust event timing in newly endemic regions. Satellite-based direct observation of AR frequency that resolves the discrepancy identified by Liu and colleagues between reanalysis products and real-world AR counts. Assessment of whether the 2024 and 2025 moisture transport records reflect a step change in the baseline or a statistical fluctuation that will not persist. Documentation of whether the 2020 hurricane suppression anomaly is a genuine signal of a changing dust-hurricane relationship, or an outlier driven by the specific atmospheric conditions of that year. The data will determine which interpretation is correct. The question is whether the monitoring and surveillance infrastructure necessary to collect that data is built before the compound events this investigation has described force the determination retrospectively rather than prospectively. The difference between this investigation and a catalog of alarming data is the forward-looking frame. What specific indicators, measurable by existing or near-term instruments, will tell us whether the compound machine described here is accelerating, stabilizing, or producing outcomes different from any of the three interpretations presented. For atmospheric rivers, the clearest near-term indicator is the 2026 moisture transport record. If the first 8 months of 2026 also break the preceding year's record, 3 consecutive annual records, that is a statistical signal inconsistent with natural variability alone at nearly any confidence level. It is the signature of a trend that has moved outside the range of decadal scale natural variability and into the range where a regime shift is the more parsimonious explanation. Watch the AR reconnaissance data being collected by CW3E throughout the 2025 through 2026 winter season. The AR reconnaissance campaign, the research aircraft program that deployed 4 instrument operating periods during the December 2025 Washington event, is producing high vertical resolution observations of AR structure that will be used both to improve forecast models and to characterize how the moisture corridors of current era events compare to those documented in earlier decades. If the campaign data shows systematic differences from historical AR profiles, deeper moisture corridors, higher IVT cores, more persistent moisture transport from further poleward origins, that is direct observational evidence of the intensification trend that the reanalysis products document at lower resolution. Watch the ArtMIP Dusty AR classification. The Tier 2 dataset that the Journal of Climate 2025 paper used includes a category for atmospheric rivers with significant mineral dust content, Dusty ARs. The frequency trend in that category has not yet been published as a standalone analysis. If the frequency of Dusty AR events is increasing alongside the general AR intensification, that would be the first direct observational evidence that the compound interaction between dust plumes and moisture corridors documented in Part 9 is not just a theoretical pathway, but an increasing empirical reality. Watch the Higgins et al. Finding about subseasonal predictability. Their geophysical research letters. 2025 paper established that the weather regimes over the North Pacific that set up extreme AR seasons are predictable 2 weeks to several months in advance. This means an operational early warning capacity for extreme AR seasons is within reach of current forecasting systems. The development of that operational capacity and the institutional decision about whether to invest in it is a near-term indicator of whether the institutional response to AR intensification is matching the pace of the phenomenon. For Saharan dust, the most critical indicator is the follow-up to the Texas A&M viability research. Chellam, Das, and Spalink, they explicitly identified longitudinal microbial viability measurements as the necessary next step, sampling the same dust events across multiple years, testing for organism viability rather than just DNA presence, and expanding the geographic coverage to include the full dust transport corridor from West Africa through the Caribbean to the Gulf Coast and inland North America. The publication of that data, whatever it shows, will resolve the most consequential open question in the biological payload investigation. Watch Prospero's Barbados record under the lens of the new molecular sequencing tools. The 50 years of filter samples at Barbados represent a physical archive of transatlantic dust transport across 5 decades. Retrospective molecular analysis of those samples using the same rDNA sequencing techniques that Texas A&M applied to the 2018 Houston event, would provide a historical baseline for biological payload trends that currently does not exist. If the diversity or abundance of pathogen-associated genera in the Barbados samples has increased over the 50-year record, that is a direct measurement of a long-term trend rather than a snapshot. Watch the valley fever case data in states that are not currently considered endemic. The CDC tracks valley fever cases nationally, and the emergence of case clusters in regions where the disease has not previously been reported is the earliest clinical signal that coccidioides has established a new territory. The fungus was found in Washington state soil before valley fever cases started appearing in Washington hospitals. The soil survey leads the clinical record, but the clinical record, when it catches up, is unambiguous. If valley fever cases begin appearing in Pacific Northwest or Intermountain West emergency rooms at rates inconsistent with travel to endemic regions, that is Goris's projection materializing in real time. For the compound interaction, the indicator is harder to define because the compound machine's most dangerous outputs are precisely the ones that don't fit neatly into any single monitoring category. A flooding event in a Pacific Northwest valley that arrives in a poleward shifted AR sequence saturates soils that have begun harboring coccidioids, deposits Saharan dust during the associated post-AR drying wind event, and produces both flood damage and an unusual cluster of respiratory illness. That compound event would currently be documented in 4 separate monitoring systems that do not communicate with each other: the flood damage in the insurance claims database, the AR event in the CW3E record, the dust arrival in NOAA's aerosol optical depth monitoring, the respiratory illness cluster in the state health department's influenza-like illness surveillance system, which has no category for Saharan dust transported pathogen exposure. The monitoring gap is not just about the absence of data. It is about the architecture of the surveillance systems themselves, designed for individual phenomena, unable to recognize the compound signatures that the interactions described in this investigation would produce. Building that cross-domain recognition capability is the institutional challenge that the next decade of increasingly frequent compound events will force one way or another. The question is whether it is built before the events make its absence undeniable. Strip everything to the evidence. What is confirmed? In the first 8 months of 2025, the global atmosphere transported more water vapor than in any previous year since satellite observations began. That record broke the record set in 2024. The ERA5 reanalysis shows a 12% increase in atmospheric moisture transport since the 1940s. AR area increased 6 to 9% between 1980 and 2023. Atmospheric rivers have shifted 6 to 10 degrees poleward in both hemispheres over the past 4 decades. What is confirmed? Back-to-back atmospheric river sequences cause 3 to 4 times more economic damage than the same events would cause individually. Category 5. Atmospheric rivers are 1,600 times more damaging than Category 1 events. Category 5. Storms are more than twice as likely to arrive in sequence with another Category 5 storm than a random distribution predicts. Category 5. Storm frequency is projected to increase 7-fold by end of century. What is confirmed? 179 million tons of dust leave the North African coast annually. The June 2020 Godzilla plume traveled 8,000 kilometers, reached 6 to 8 kilometers altitude, produced aerosol optical depth of 3.5 off West Africa, and drove PM10 concentrations to 453 micrograms per cubic meter in Puerto Rico, 10 times the WHO daily guideline. In 2020, the largest dust storm in the satellite record arrived simultaneously with one of the most active Atlantic hurricane seasons on record, breaking the established dust-hurricane suppression relationship in a way that its principal investigator described as requiring a re-evaluation of the underlying theory. What is confirmed? The DNA of multiple organisms on the World Health Organization's lists of global priority human pathogens was identified in Saharan dust arriving in Houston, Texas in 2018. The Czech Republic Saharan dust event of March and April 2024 drove PM10 concentrations to 6 to 8 times above normal atmospheric conditions. Dust particles carry trace elements including lead, cadmium, and zinc. The metal bioaerosol combination creates conditions for reactive oxygen species generation. Chronic exposure leads to documented respiratory inflammation and airway remodeling. What is confirmed? Valley fever cases in California increased fivefold between 2001 and 2021. Cases nationally increased 400% between 1998 and 2015. The fungus that causes valley fever has been found in Washington state. Morgan Gorris's climate niche model projects the endemic region expanding to the U.S.-Canadian border under high warming scenarios. What is uncertain? Whether the consecutive moisture transport records of 2024 and 2025 represent a regime shift or a point on a gradual trend. Whether Saharan dust pathogens survive the transoceanic crossing in viable infectious form. Whether the 2020 hurricane suppression anomaly represents a permanent change in the dust storm relationship or an outlier event. Whether the compound interaction between intensifying ARS and changing Saharan dust dynamics is producing emergent behaviors that neither phenomenon would produce alone. What is unknown? The behavior of a warming Atlantic Saharan air layer interacting with intensifying and poleward shifting atmospheric river systems at scales not yet observed. Whether the monitoring infrastructure for biological dust events can be built faster than the events themselves are intensifying. What the first major compound event, a Category 5 AR sequence, arriving in a newly endemic valley fever region during a biologically characterized Saharan dust intrusion, looks like from the inside of a public health system that was not designed to recognize it. This investigation has been built around a question that the opening evidence made unavoidable. What is happening to the invisible storm above us, and why does it matter now in ways it did not matter in the same way 20 years ago? The honest answer is this. The moisture records are breaking. The storms are intensifying and migrating. The dust is carrying a biological payload that science has only begun to characterize. The compound interactions between these two phenomena are real, documented at the mechanistic level, and incompletely mapped at the scale of their potential compound consequences. And the monitoring, surveillance, and emergency management systems that would allow anticipation rather than retrospective response are lagging behind the phenomena in ways that specific, named scientists have explicitly identified as gaps requiring investment. That is not a conclusion. It is a status report from the edge of an investigation that has no clean closing scene. Because the phenomena are ongoing, the data is still arriving, and the open questions are not rhetorical. They are operational. F. Martin Ralph and his team at CW3E are in the air above the North Pacific right now, or will be again before this season ends, sampling the moisture corridors that will determine whether the 2026 winter continues the trend that 2024 and 2025 have established. Shankar Chelam and his colleagues at Texas A&M are working toward the longitudinal viability study that will answer the most consequential open question in the biological payload investigation. Morgan Gorris at Los Alamos is updating the valley fever distribution models as new case data arrives from newly endemic regions. The Barbados station is still running, still collecting, still building the 50-plus year record that Joseph Prospero established, and that has become one of the most important long-term atmospheric chemistry data sets in the world. The investigation continues because the phenomena continue. The rivers in the sky are not static. The wall of dust crossing the Atlantic is not static. The soils of the American West are not static. The ocean temperatures driving everything described in this investigation are not static. And Signal Watch will be here, watching the data, tracking the publications, following the CW3E reconnaissance results, monitoring the valley fever case reports from newly endemic regions, reporting what the evidence shows as it arrives without embellishment and without minimization. We will be watching. We will be here when the next record breaks. And the community that has been watching this investigation to its end is the reason that watching is possible at all.
There is a river above you right now. It is bigger than it was 20 years ago. It is heading somewhere different. And what it carries, water, dust, and whatever is living inside that dust, is the story this channel will not stop following until the science has answered every question it has raised. The investigation continues.